Well, I'm the type of guy who never settles down. Pretty girls are, you know that I'm around. Kiss them and I love them, 'cause to me they're all the same. I hug them and I squeeze them, they don't even know my name. I'm the wanderer, yeah, I'm the wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. Hello and welcome to Choice Conversations. I'm your host, Chris Stefanik. Today, I'm going to be replaying another Reboot Your Kids podcast episode from last summer. So I've been replaying that series, the parenting podcast that I had recorded with Kevin Geary. This one's a little different. It's the 7th episode of Reboot Your Kids. It's different because this was just Kevin interviewing Dr. Dan Siegel. I was not able to make it to the interview that day, so Kevin interviewed him without me, and I debated whether or not to put this one into the Choice Conversations feed since it didn't actually contain me as a co-host on it, but for the sake of completeness, to get all of the Reboot Your Kids podcasts, I've decided to put this one into the Choice Conversations feed. So Kevin talks to Dan about his book, No Drama Discipline, and it's a really, really good parenting podcast. You should check it out. This is going to be the last one. This will complete the series. So after this, we'll dig into a lot of good stuff as we move forward here. I'm excited to kick off a new series. So I'm going to be kicking off one that's around lifestyle design, life hacks, if you will. Tell you about the tips and tricks that I've implemented in my life to help me be successful in all areas. Look for that coming up pretty shortly here. All right, let's just dive right into it. No Drama Discipline, Reboot Your Kids, Episode 7. Enjoy it.
All right, I want to welcome Dr. Dan Siegel to the show today. Dr. Siegel is the author of some groundbreaking books on parenting and child development. His latest book, No Drama Discipline, provides an effective, compassionate roadmap for dealing with tantrums, tensions, and tears. Dr. Siegel's work is unique in that it places an emphasis on helping parents understand the relationship between brain development and their child's behavior. Welcome to the show, Dr. Siegel.
Kevin, a pleasure to be here with you.
So how did you get into the parenting realm? Obviously, you've written a lot of books, not all of them on parenting, right? So is this just a passion of yours, and you've taken your research and your focus in that direction?
Yeah, it is a passion of mine. I think that's a great way to say it. And I work in a broad field where we put all the sciences together and then apply science to life. So we do that in psychotherapy and education and just general living. And one of the ways we do that is through the field of parenting. And so as a parent myself, I felt really excited and motivated to try to translate this science for all parents to understand and then to use in their everyday parenting.
Perfect. And I definitely want to get into that today. I want to, let's talk about discipline. And I think in No Drama Discipline, you're really talking about taking back the word discipline, so to speak. A lot of people are, in the peaceful parenting realm, are a little cautious of using the word discipline just because of the connotation, right? And that really hits home for me because you have a conversation with somebody about peaceful parenting and you inevitably get the argument, but kids need discipline. So what do you say to that?
Right. I think that's an excellent point, Kevin. And part of the challenge is that we've come to see the word discipline as meaning punishment.
Right.
So you say, I'm going to discipline a kid, you're going to punish them. The word discipline actually means to teach. So a disciple, for example, is a student, not a prisoner. And a disciple is someone who's been having discipline from a teacher, that is, having teaching from a teacher. So our role as parents can be reclaimed as really teachers, not prison wardens. And when we understand this, we can even look at things as profound as, well, a kid's misbehavior needs punishment. Well, no, it doesn't need punishment. It needs a consequence, which is a natural reaction to a misbehavior so the child learns because you are teaching them, not punishing them. And this can really help us when we take it apart, free us. It can really help us be the kind of parent most of us really want to be.
That's a great point. And I think people, when they make that argument, are also thinking that peaceful parenting doesn't set limits and doesn't have boundaries, right? So the suggestion to discipline is, in your terms, is quite the opposite. We are setting limits and boundaries. We're just doing so with warmth and patience. And you talk about how this consistent limit setting wires the brain in a healthy manner. Can you talk more about that?
Absolutely. Well, think about it this way. We're all mammals, and what mammals need is the care of adult figures called attachment figures to actually help them not only when they're distressed to be soothed, but also to help them learn about the world. Now, as human beings, we're even more dependent on our caregivers because of lots of anatomical reasons. We come out super immature. And that's not to put a baby down, it's just to put a perspective that babies are really, really dependent on us. When babies move into their toddler period and then into preschool and then beyond, what they're doing is learning from us, their adults, how to live in the world. And one of the things they learn, and again, this is looking at the parenting role as a teacher, not a punisher, is they need to learn from us about how to soothe their own emotions. They need to learn from us how to contain their impulses, like to run in the street and not run in the street, even if a ball is going out there. They have to learn from us how to control overall their behavior, how to treat other people with respect, and ultimately how to act as contributing members of our society who are ethical and moral beings who think about ways to improve the world. So all of those skills are things that are taught by parents. Kids learn them not by being punished, which just gets them to fear us, but actually by leaning on us as their guides, as their teachers. And that's really what childhood is all about.
So a lot of people think that by punishing, they're teaching. How is that not accurate?
Okay, that's a great question, Kevin. Really good. So let's start with the basics. All these things about teaching a child to regulate, let's say, her attention, to regulate her impulses, to regulate his emotions so that they can be revved up and life can have meaning, but not too revved up so things get chaotic. Those are all called regulation. They fall under the term self-regulation. We learn self-regulation from the adults around us, from our attachment figures like our parents. And then when we get to preschool, we learn them from our teachers. Self-regulation is something you learn by interactions where the caregiver attunes to what's going on with you. They figure out what's happening with you. They help guide you in what's called scaffold your development. And what happens then is you can get emotional, or you can pay attention to something else than what you're supposed to be paying attention to, or you act on an impulse. And with the connection of your parent, who then guides you, you actually grow the fibers in your brain, and we know exactly where they are, that a relationship experience of connection grows those fibers well. So you develop what's called resilience. You develop strong self-regulatory circuits in the brain. And if we were together, I would point to my hand and show you where in this hand model of the brain these circuits are. But we know how relationships do that. Now, the difference between that kind of teaching, which comes from connecting and redirecting a child's behavior, the difference between that and punishment is this. You can absolutely train a baby and a toddler and a preschool kid and a younger child. You can train them like you do a dog. You can yell at them and scream at them and make them frightened to, do something. And that will change their behavior for that one specific thing. Don't chew on the rug. You scream, scream, scream. That's called fear-induced behavioral change. And you can do that. And that's what, unfortunately, a lot of parents are turning to because they think, children need structure. Structure comes from discipline. Discipline is punishment. Punishment means inducing some very uncomfortable state like fear or sometimes pain. So that's my duty. I have to induce this punishment. And that's just wrong-headed thinking. And the research shows, by the way, that kind of fear-induced behavioral change doesn't develop self-regulatory skills. It just develops a modification of that particular behavior.
And is that due to the fact that punishment or, some administration of pain, whether it's emotional pain or physical pain, breaks the connection between the parent and the child? Like, you talk about the paradox of pain in the way that children are really biologically wired to connect with their parents, but the pain and the fear drive them away. So what's happening in the child's brain in this paradox?
Yeah, well, at the extreme, and this is, again, unusual, but it does happen, and sometimes in 5 to 15% of the population, depending on your study, parents are causing terror inside of a child. And in attachment research, and I'm trained as an attachment researcher, how we define that, what we say about that, is that this is called a biological paradox. And the paradox is that one very deep circuit in the brain, very old 300 million year old reptilian circuit, says, hey, if I'm terrorized of something, if I'm feeling terror, I need to get away from that which is causing the terror in me. That's step one. The second circuit in the brain is a little bit younger. It's only 200 million years old, and that's the attachment circuit. And what the attachment circuit is all about in our old mammalian brains is this. If I'm really distressed, including feeling frightened and terrified, I need to go to my attachment figure to be soothed and protected. Well, if one individual, the parent, is the source of terror, then you have two circuits in the brain. The mammalian one says go to the attachment figure, but the reptilian one says get away from the source of terror, who is the attachment figure, and the brain basically fragments. It can't come up with a resolvable situation, how to deal with this. What can you do? I don't know what to do. There's nothing to do. So it just falls apart. It's called a disorganized approach. And there's all sorts of fragmentation of the mind that research has shown develop when you give this biological paradox repeatedly without repair, because any kid can have this sometimes. And I always put examples where I may have scared my kids, but then how I repaired it afterwards. There's no such thing as perfect parenting. So your parents listening to this shouldn't freak out. Right. We should just be inspired to say, okay, if I terrified my kid here, I need to go back and make a reconnection. Repair. It's never too late to make a repair. And when you have the idea of doing that, it makes everything different.
Can you give some examples of the ramifications of this fragmentation when this does happen and when it happens repeatedly? What does that look like in the real world in terms of how these children behave later on, maybe even as adults?
Yeah. Now, the research is most readily done on the extremes of these parenting approaches. So it's easier to do the statistics, and we can infer ideas about more subtle variations. So I'll talk about what we do know from the research. When you've had these repeated experiences of being terrified of your parent, either severe neglect or outright either abuse, like physical abuse, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, or even cases where you as a parent, let's say, have a drug addiction problem and I come home drunk all the time, and I'm not overtly trying to terrify my kid, but I look terrifying because I'm so drunk. Or in cases of domestic abuse, I'm beating up my spouse, which happens to be your mother. And I'm not doing something directly, but the kid is terrified of what they're witnessing. All those different situations are terror-inducing in a child. And the outcome is something called disorganized attachment. And what that's associated with basically is, number one, a fragmentation of the mind called dissociation, where I can feel unreal inside of me. I can feel disconnected from my body. Under stress, I can stop reasoning well, and my mind can't think clearly. When I have emotions arise, they can sometimes take over, and I don't really feel kind of integrated or whole. And then when I relate to other people, I may have a real hard time sensing what's going on in them clearly, especially if things get emotional. So my close relationships can be really challenging and not so rewarding for the other person. And so people may try to avoid me. So clearly, in all these ways, whether it's my emotional life, my social life, or my thinking life, I've got real challenges, and my whole mind is in a way betraying me because it fragments. So I don't even really have a clear sense of who I am at times. So that's not so good. And that's what research shows in these extreme cases of disorganized attachment without therapy and without repair. This is what can go on for decades.
And of course, this is all on a scale, right? So the more damaging this trauma is, probably the worse the outcome. But that doesn't mean that scaling back the trauma will create no consequence, right? There's probably just less of a consequence.
Yeah, well, this is a really excellent scientific question, and it's harder to study. It's and when you do research, you have to be clear. The subjects you're putting in a certain category are really there. So when you get more subtle variations, there's different ways of interpreting it. So from a clinical point of view, now not from overt research where you empirically study these things and statistically analyze them, I can tell you from my clinical work over the last 30 years, what you see is that parents who don't see the mind of the child, I call it mind sight, that is, aren't tuned into the feelings of the child or aren't wondering what's the child thinking or what was the child's intention. Parents who lack mindsight or don't apply mindsight in their parenting have kids who really are restricted in how they develop. And what I mean by that is your capacity to know your own emotions as a kid, research shows this, is dependent on how your parent talks to you about your own emotional state. Your ability to know your own fabric of memory of who you are is really nurtured by how your parents talk to you about what you remember. If you went to a zoo together, how you make a story about that. So your memory, your emotion, even the way you relate to other people are directly affected by the kind of parenting approach parents offer. That's been shown. Clinically, what I've noticed is those kids who grow up in a mind-sightless family have trouble even knowing their own inner world, their mind. And therefore, they have a lot more challenges because to regulate your inner state, your feelings, your thoughts, your impulses, you got to know your mind. And if some parents are not focused on that and they're doing the best they can, I understand that, they're actually not giving the optimal kinds of experiences. In my view, clinically, parents who tend to turn to punishing have a tendency not to have mindsight. They just see the behavior and not the mind that's driving the behavior. And so for me, all of this work I do is about the process of mindsight. And when you teach mindsight to parents, it completely changes their approach to parenting. And the experiences that kids have are so enriching. And this is why, whether you look at the book I wrote, the textbook called The Developing Mind, which summarizes all this stuff, the second edition is now out, or Parenting from the Inside Out, which I wrote with Mary Hartzell to help parents develop mindsight in themselves, or The Whole Brain Child, which helps you develop mindsight in your child, or No Drama Discipline, which just tries to reclaim, the discipline as teaching, or the book I wrote for, parents of adolescents and adolescents themselves, Brainstorm. All of these books basically are mindsight books. They say, how can I teach the insight, empathy, and integration is the term of mindsight skills? And if you just look at the Brainstorm book, for example, you'll see these gray pages, which even if you're not an adolescent now, you can actually do the exercise in that book and develop your mindsight skills.
I think that's a good segue. You give a 3-step process for approaching a discipline situation. And the first step is to ask yourself, why did my child act this way? And you're right. It seems like this is the step that often gets skipped when we're talking about conventional discipline. I would argue that this is the most critical step because it sets the foundation for how you're going to respond as a parent.
Completely. If you think about the why question, it says, beneath what I observe with my physical sight, what I saw happening as action in the world, behavior, there is a mental life of someone's intentions, someone's feelings, someone's memories, the meaning of things, the story for them, what was going on inside of them. The inside means their mental life, which includes the body sensations, images, feelings, thoughts. So I remember that with the word sift. You Check in on your sensations, that's the S, images, the I, F is feelings, and T is thoughts. At a minimum, the why question has you as a parent sift your child's mind, and maybe even your own, to say, why did this misbehavior just happen? And parents who just punish often don't do that. They're just simply saying, this was a violation of what I expected. In the naughty chair, go for a 30-minute timeout, or something that's an inappropriate usage of a standard practice. Timeouts are supposed to be brief and infrequent, explained ahead of time. Often they're just used as punishment, which is not how they were designed.
Yeah, and I think this stems from maybe an underlying concept of kids do well when they're taught or corrected versus, I don't know if you're familiar with Ross Greene's work, but he's famously said that kids do well if they can. It sounds like a very simplistic statement, but it's a very different approach from like conventional discipline, who assumes that maybe the child is going to be automatically disobedient or quote unquote bad unless I parent properly, unless I do the necessary corrections and all of this other stuff. So why do kids fail to do well consistently? If we take the approach that they want to do well or they will do well if they can, what would cause them to can't, to not be able to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a great question. I think one way to think about that is, kids, young kids, are in the process of really, really deep development. That is, the circuits of their brain are not developed to where we might think they should be. So, for example, a 2-year-old hitting his 4-year-old sister because she didn't let him play with her blocks that she was playing with her friends, for example. You could say, what's wrong with him? Well, he's 2. And his circuits of controlling his anger and his impulses to hit haven't developed yet. And that's very natural. That's typical for his age. A lot of us as parents aren't familiar with the natural developmental stages. Now, there's an old Russian psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, and he had a great term called the zone of proximal development. And all that fancy word means about the zone is a kid being by himself can do a certain amount. But a kid with an adult scaffolding their learning, as the adult acts as a teacher, can do a lot more. When you as a parent get a feeling of where that child's zone is, you tune your parenting to the zone of proximal development, meaning you allow the child to scaffold their achievements not beyond where they can go with your help, which a lot of parents do, sadly, but where they can achieve with your help. And you help move them up from the bottom level. You move it up a rung of the ladder at a time. What often happens, and to answer your question, Kevin, about why, some kids don't seem to respond well, is parents have expectations that are unrealistic for the zone. Mm-hmm. They go way beyond the zone of what a kid that age can do, even with assistance. And therefore, the child isn't responding to their interventions. Then they often get frustrated and punish the kid, which does nothing to really increase the zone of proximal development, to raise it up on the ladder. And so what you see is this sad cycle where then people start accusing the kid of having a problem. And you see these young kids being put on medications and being told they have diagnostic problems of this disease or that disease. The saddest thing for me as a child psychiatrist trained in that way of thinking is it's really not good thinking. It's not looking at how relationships help shape the brain of that child. So by the time that child is 2 or 3, they've had a ton of interactive experiences, or the lack of them, that have shaped how they have been able to function or not function. And so instead of giving them a pill, let's give them a relationship that's present, whereas many of us are just distracted as parents. We're overwhelmed. We're not spending the same amount of time with our kids. When we do spend time, we don't know exactly what to do. And I see, sadly, a lot of parents, this is kind of amazing to say this, but I see a lot of parents actually distracted by their smartphones. They put their kids in front of a tablet or a computer or a television screen, and there's not much relational scaffolding going on. And then people complain, what's going on? Well, that's what's going on.
Right. The electronic babysitter, right?
Oh, my God. The studies, even some colleagues of mine, Andy Meltzoff and Patricia Kuehl up at University of Washington, They did a study to show that even if you have a good intention behind your babysitting attempt, like let's say the Baby Einstein tapes, what that was shown to do was not advance language development, but actually have less language development. And it wasn't that they were bad tapes. It's that watching takes away time for true interpersonal engagement and interaction and attunement, which is where learning takes place.
And this is really the foundation of, a kid's misbehavior is really just them communicating that they don't have the skills to deal with the situation at hand, which should, in our minds as parents, trigger that teacher mode, not the punisher mode. Like the punishment is not going to give them the skills, right? It's only the teacher that can give the skills. That's
right. If you just shape it just the way you did, Kevin, you say, okay, my job as a teacher to help develop skills, not a punisher, either imprisoning a child as a prison warden or just whipping a child to modify their behavior by fear. It's completely different interview that you have about your role. And what it does is about the why question you started with, is it makes you say, why did this happen? And then the next questions, are, what do I actually really want my child to learn from this issue? And then how can I make that happen? So you go after the why, you go after the what, and the how. And this allows you literally to become empowered as a parent. This is why we wrote up No Drama Discipline, because after Whole Brain Child, Tina Bryson and I got so much feedback about it that it was useful. And we found that this fundamental statement, connect and then redirect, contained within those few words everything. The connect is tune into the inner experience of your child. The redirect is think about deeply what you want the skill to be learned. And you can imagine that if you reframe these difficult and challenging moments as actually the best opportunities you have to teach your child, to connect with your child, to have them develop the skills you want them to have when they leave home, then you'll reframe what you think of these challenging moments. And you'll say, yeah, they're hard, but they're golden moments of opportunity.
And I guess to remember or try to remind yourself that when you resort to punishment, that is actually in place of the teaching that you could be doing. That you're really severing the connection at that point, and it's going to be hard to teach a legitimate or an authentic lesson because you've placed a child in fight or flight, or you have caused them to think solely about your actions now versus perhaps the actions that they're now being reprimanded for. So there's a lot going on that's not teaching.
Exactly, and that's a really lovely way to say it. Is it's a missed opportunity as well as inducing fear in your child. You brought up another thing, Kevin, I just got to really respond to. It's a really important distinction. And in the workshops I do, I do this, where I'll say no really harshly several times, and I'll say yes really calmly several times. And the no induces a state of reactivity, and the yes brings on a state of what's called receptivity. So at a very minimum, as parents, we need to realize we have these two states. We can be reactive or receptive. When we're reactive, we may want to fight, we may want to flee, we may want to freeze up and tighten our muscles, or we may totally collapse out of helplessness and faint. Those are the 4 F's of reactivity: fight, flee, freeze, and faint. Now, we can be reactive, and when we are, we can't parent effectively. So we need to know what our own state is and move ourselves from this reactive state to a receptive state where literally your muscles relax, you think more clearly, you're able to take in what's going on in other people, you can engage in the social world. In the series I edit, we have 40 textbooks out for professionals, and I have a 350-page book that Steve Porges wrote for our series right in there that talks about this one issue. How do you move from reactivity to receptivity? So there's a lot of science behind it. For parenting purposes, the first stage of any parenting move is to take your own pulse and figure out, am I reactive, receptive? How can I get myself to receptivity? The second thing is to say, is my child reactive or receptive? Now, obviously, if there's something dangerous, like your child is running into the street in front of a truck, you got to grab them and make sure they don't get run over. So there are obvious first aid things, that you stop and you don't do this process. The child's life and bodily safety are number one. So, that's for sure. But in terms of more common parenting moments, are you reactive or are you receptive? And is your kid reactive or receptive? And the idea of connect and then redirect is this. Connecting brings a child from reactivity, fight, flight, freeze, or faint, to receptivity, open engagement, readiness to learn. And sadly, what's happening with a lot of us as parents, we're so busy, so overwhelmed, so tired, so confused, that we engage in our own reactive state. Our kid is reactive, and you have two reactive beings, the parent and the child, who are then exploding in reactivity, and then all these punishments are being given, including inappropriate use of timeouts, long extended periods of being in isolation where there's hostility in the going into the isolation and there's no positive connection in the coming out. And that we call an inappropriate timeout. Different from the appropriate timeout of limited, take a break from an experience, think about what you're happening, plan it ahead of time, use this infrequently, have them be brief. And when a child exits from a brief timeout like that, you give them positive connection. So, this whole view then is to connect first. So you can really allow a child to move from reactivity to receptivity. And when they're receptive, then you then can engage in the learning process with them. What happened? Why was this not appropriate? I understand you're doing the best you can. Maybe you didn't understand this or that. I understand you were mad at your sister. We don't take anger and turn it into, hitting her. I understand why you did. I get it. You're not a bad person, but your action was inappropriate. So that's a distinction that is huge. Instead, parents often are angry and yell at their kids. They humiliate them. And sadly, what a kid learns from that is not just to fear the parent, but also to feel that they themselves are defective. And that's not very healthy.
And to use that as a tactic, right? Because obviously if my parent's doing it, this is being modeled to me as a legitimate communication strategy. If they're shouting at me, well, why can't I shout at them? It seems to be legitimate. I'm also glad you brought it up because in that situation, out of the two people, the parent is the only one who's capable of breaking the reactivity cycle. I don't think a child is capable of rationalizing even when the parent is unable to or seems to be unable to, right?
Well, that's true. And if they are doing that as a young child, I can tell you my adolescents have been wonderful to help me, but that's later on. But when they're younger, it's called, parentification. That is, you are having role reversal. You're putting your child in the role of taking care of you. And believe it or not, that's unhealthy for a child. You as an attachment figure are supposed to be the care provider. And if you're having all sorts of problems, as my daughter once said to me, work it out on your own time. Don't put your child in the position of having to be caretaker of you. And that role reversal has long-term effects on a child's well-being.
I think it's also important to add here that a lot of times I think we hold our kids to a much higher standard that we hold ourselves in that, we're not perfect as parents and our child is, we talk about them. Why can't they do well all the time, right? Why do they still end up breaking rules? Because parents do it too, right? None of us are perfect and we want other people to give us the benefit of the doubt. But a lot of times, for some reason, we won't extend that same respect to our children.
Yeah, exactly. And it's, there's probably a lot of reasons for it, and it depends on the relationship. But one of the things is, we have high expectations in our mind that sometimes interfere with our ability to see our child clearly. Now, expectations in the sense of high standards and having a strategy and a direction, those are all beautiful, beautiful things. But what we're talking about is previously existing judgments, like a template, that if your child doesn't meet the criteria that you previously established, then you will actually see them as deficient. And they will pick that up in you, and you will be really hard on them because they're not meeting your fixed expectations. The studies of parenting show the more a parent can attune to what a child is actually like, the more that child will thrive. And so it doesn't mean you don't create structure. You do create structure. It doesn't mean you don't teach skills. You do teach skills. You're always helping your child be the best person that child can be, not that they're trying to become what you expected the kind of person they should be is. Now, this sounds subtle because you could say, well, shouldn't you have expectations for moral behavior and all this kind of stuff? Of course you should. That's a different sort of thing. But if you expect your child, let's say, to be really extroverted and out there, being the life of the party, and your child's quiet and introverted, you need to tune into your child's temperament and learn what your child is all about and let go of those expectations for an extrovert so you can optimize how you see your child, how you tune into your child, and your child's going to pick up that you really, really love who they are. And they're going to stop, sadly, what often happens, which is experiencing that I'm just not good enough. And that's where kids learn that.
So step 2 of approaching discipline is to ask yourself, what lesson do I want to teach in this moment? And in terms of conventional discipline, this would probably be where the reprimanding would be taking place. What does the alternative look like? What should we really be focused on doing in this stage?
Well, the first thing is to really say that this is, parenting is a long haul thing. It's a long distance run, not a sprint. So the individual things that happen to us, sometimes we think, I got to beat this one. I got to beat this one. You got to have your eye on the prize, which is when your kid leaves home, whenever that is, 40, 50 years of age, when they finally leave home, you are getting ready for an 18-year-old, for example, to have the skills of feeling good in their skin, knowing how to relate to other people with empathy and compassion, having a moral sense, having a sense of who they are and how to contribute to society, knowing what their emotions are and how to balance them, knowing how to actually connect when things get rough and realize that the more effort they put in, the more they're going to be able to achieve. All these things are things you learn from your parents. So with that as the long-range prize, then you say, how do I fit in this movement? Well, I want to reprimand my child. Well, is reprimanding my child right now getting to me to where I want to go when this kid is 18? Not really. What I'm going to do is say, what just happened where you hit your sister really made your sister really unhappy. So there you're identifying internal state unhappiness. It made her really frustrated with you, and she may even think in the future, so now you're talking about memory, that she doesn't want to play with you. So I just want to understand why you hit her and knocked her toys down when she was playing with her friend. Well, she didn't play with me. I wanted her to play with me, and she didn't play with me, so I knocked down all her stuff. You say, I understand that you were feeling really frustrated, and that frustration made you act on a feeling you had, which was you were so mad that you wanted to carry that out with your hand and knock her thing down. Yeah, that's right. She didn't play with me. And you felt really lonely. Yeah, and he's crying. And then you say, I really understand how those feelings you had were so big inside of you that they made you take an action. You moved your body in a way that was not so good for your sister. So I need to teach you actually that a feeling is fine, but an action that hurts someone else is not okay. So let's figure out an alternative to how you can have a big feeling and not have an action that hurts someone. And then you do some problem solving together, even with a 2-year-old. You see, what this whole interaction allows you to do is allows you to teach your child that feelings exist. Here's how you can be aware of feelings. Feelings lead to changes in the way you think. Feelings lead to changes in the way you behave. And you are responsible, maybe not for the content of your feelings, but you are responsible for your actions. And this separation of feeling from action is basically what the basis of emotional intelligence is all about. It's also what social intelligence is all about. So this is an opportunity for you to teach those skills. And reprimanding does very little to achieve any of that.
And of course, step 3 is how do you best teach the lesson? And you just kind of, it quickly, I think, goes from, because the dialogue that you were having with the child is actually the process of teaching now, right?
Absolutely. And this is where I call them reflective dialogues, meaning you're both sharing in a looking inward. What is the mental state? Intentions, feelings, thoughts, impulses, all that stuff is mental stuff. What's the inner process that drives an outer behavior? Because basically what parents are wanting to reprimand or punish or put in a timeout or whatever they're doing are behaviors. And they ignore the inner experience. So I just use the word reflective dialogue, that phrase, so that people can realize I'm going to have a dialogue, a conversation around the internal nature of the mind. Now, I can also use the term time in. I can use the term mindsight. I can use the word. There's all sorts of science words we can use. But whatever word you use, the science is really clear. Parents who have discussions with their children that focus on the inner nature of mental life, feelings, thoughts, memories, intentions, all that, have children who develop emotion understanding, emotion regulation, understanding of memory. They have better relationships with other kids. They're thriving. It's a teachable skill. I call these mindsight skills. This mindset capacity is what we learned from our parents.
And this is why children don't need extrinsic consequences, right? That if you build the skills, like why would the consequence be needed? If you were going to use pain, some sort of pain as a consequence to stop the same behavior from happening in the future, well, if you met the underlying issue and you gave the child the tools and they have the empathy to, and you know that they want to do well intrinsically as a human being, they will now take that insight or that mindsight, as you were saying, and they will alter their future behavior. They don't need the painful consequence now piled on top of all this to make sure that that happens.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And so it sounds really simple, and it is, but can be challenging. Let's not lie. But when you learn this, it's really incredible because it gives you a grounding in what to do that changes everything.
The parent's attitude during discipline is obviously really important. In the book, you talk about the difference between healthy shame and toxic shame. What is the difference?
Yeah, so healthy shame, shame is a word that can evoke a lot of feelings in us. So, in the developing mind, I talk a lot about this from a scientific point of view. If you say to a child, that really wasn't okay that you knocked your sister's toys down and hit her, that's inducing a state of shame. That is, I feel right now that something about what I did and maybe even who I am was not good. That was not good. And then you connect with your child. You go, well, tell me what was going on. Well, I was feeling angry because she wasn't playing with me. Now you're tuning into them. So instead of it being toxic shame, it's healthy in that it was a feeling like something that happened was not right, and I got to make it right in the future. Toxic shame would be something like this. How dare you knock your sister's toys down? That's really stupid of you. You're such a bad boy. Now go to your room for 30 minutes. Now, that is shame because I feel like I've done something wrong. Maybe there's something wrong with me. Mm-hmm. And now I'm humiliated. You haven't connected with me, so I don't feel like there's anything in me that's good. You've screamed and yelled at me and not only missed an opportunity to connect with me, but now you're shoving me in isolation, so I feel like I'm a bad person. And I'm just seething in this toxic shame. This toxic shame, when combined with humiliation, is what I think happens, gets encoded inside of me so that it isn't just that I think my behavior was wrong and I need to correct in the future. I think there's something defective about who I am. The essence of me is garbage. There's something wrong with me. And sadly, when I grow up, I may push this down and make this go subterranean so I'm not aware of it because it's so painful. But the reality is I feel like I'm a piece of junk. And I go around life like that. If I even accomplish things, I think it's just a fake. If people love me, I think that's fundamentally a problem. Because, first of all, why would I accept the love from someone who was so stupid as to love me. Or if they did love me and I loved them, I would feel so nervous because one day they're going to discover the truth that I'm a piece of junk. So either way, I'm in a lose-lose situation. And you see these sad ways in which someone with this toxic shame, often coupled with humiliation, is going to embed itself in this shame dynamic, is what it's called, this spiral, where I will have very unrewarding relationships, or I'll take relationships that could have been rewarding and I'll get rid of them. And I'm constantly picking people who hate me to be close to because they're safer, because after all, that's all I'm worthy of. And that's what you see. I talk a lot about this in a book called Mindsight, in the chapter on a person I call Matthew. But this is what we want to avoid. This is deeply, deeply, deeply what we want to avoid as parents, is inducing toxic shame.
And truthfully, this is really happening. When we talk about conventional discipline, I think this is kind of the foundation of conventional discipline, isn't it? Like, labeling children's behavior, shouting at them, telling them they're this and that, and using moralization of good and bad. And, I try to explain to parents that when you say that's bad to, especially a really, very, really, really young child, they may not be able to discern the difference between you thinking their behavior is bad and you thinking that they are bad as a person. Sometimes the lines can get very blurred there, right?
Well, that's exactly right. And, I think for me, after writing The Developing Mind, where, you'll see all of this spelled out in great biological detail, when I extracted from that book lessons for parents with my daughter's preschool director, Mary Hartzell, and we wrote Parenting from the Inside Out, I really felt so impassioned to translate this knowledge for parents. And in Parenting from the Inside Out, what you see is a journey to explore what that may have been like for you. Because if you had these experiences and you feel like a piece of junk inside, especially if you're not aware that that's actually how you feel, then it's natural when you have a child who's not doing what you think they should do for you to become very reactive, because they're revealing the truth, which is that I'm defective. So this is the terrible cycle that I see all the time as a clinician, is that parents are unaware of their own shame dynamic in themselves. They start inducing that shame dynamic in their kid. They start saying their kid is a no good, rotten this or that, and they miss the entire picture, which is that they're replaying exactly the catastrophes, subtle or not so subtle, that happened to them. And this is why in Parenting from the Inside Out, you go through a journey of reflecting on what happened to you to liberate yourself from those experiences.
That's such great insight. I know we're coming up on time. My readers and listeners wanted to ask you more about the technique of storytelling. Can we talk about that a little bit before we wrap up?
Absolutely. We are storytelling creatures, and the way we make sense of our lives and our interactions with others is through telling stories, both with each other and even inside our own minds. Studies, for example, of telling stories through journal writing show that you improve your immune function, and you can actually resolve traumas all sorts of ways by writing out your life story. Stories are what connect us to each other. And for a parent-child relationship, when tough things happen, stories are the way we get through them. So in our family, when one of our children had a really terrible thing happen, and there were nightmares and all sorts of other things, we sat down, we had a family time to tell the story. You start with before the event happened, what happened just before the event, what was it like in the event, what happened immediately after the event, what are the consequences of the event, and you basically, it's the linear telling of a sequence of events. All the nightmares stopped after we told the story of the experience. And even to this day, if you think about it, stories are really the deep way we make sense of our lives. I call it integration. We integrate our lives. And this is where basically all of these books, whether it's Brainstorm or Whole Brain Child or No Drama Discipline or Parenting from the Inside Out or Mindsight, it's all about making sense of your life. And whether you're doing this as an adult on your own or doing this as an adult to care for children and adolescents in your life, that's what it's all about. And when you make sense of your life, the beautiful thing is you become more present for what's happening. You let go of your expectations. You become available to really deeply connect with your inner life and your relationships with people you care about so much.
And what are the best, circumstances or situations where you would recommend that people make sure the storytelling happens?
Well, stories are really invited when there's what's called a violation of an expectation. And that word's a little rough, violation. But basically, in our family, someone had an accident. No one expected that accident would happen. So it's a violation of what you expect. And if you don't tell a story about it, your whole sense of the future, which happens in post-traumatic stress that's not resolved, your whole sense of the future becomes foreshortened, and you can feel helpless and hopeless. So a story, in the case of a traumatic event, is absolutely crucial to liberate yourself from this lack of a sense of the future. In more minor ways, things happen all the time. In school, at the end of the day, kids can talk about things, and they don't have to talk about the routine things. They can talk about, Johnny did this, Sarah did that, all the different things that happen. So a story has embedded in it two things. It has the actions that occur and the inner mental experience of the people in the story. So the feelings, the thoughts. Just remember the word sift. What sensations were going on in the body, what images, what feelings, what thoughts. When you sift in a story, you allow that mental side of the story combined with the action items to be woven together, and that's how you make sense of everything. There's always an opportunity for stories, but especially when there's emotional intensity. That's when a story should really be brought up in a family.
And you're also using this within the discipline model that we already discussed?
Well, totally. I mean, you tell the story with Johnny about why he hit his sister so he can understand he's just a human being, and a growing human being at that, who can learn skills. There's a beautiful idea, that's the story of Carol Dweck, of the mindset of growth or the mindset of being fixed. Mm-hmm. We want our kids to know that growth mindsets mean you learn from experience, that even though things are tough, there's always new learning to happen, and that's what it means to be human. Sadly, a lot of people have what's called a fixed mindset. They think you're supposed to know everything up front, and it's a sign of your natural intelligence, your natural skills, or natural abilities, or talents, or whatever. We want to really encourage our children to develop a growth mindset, that learning and development happen from effort, that you can't get anywhere without making, quote, mistakes, unquote, and those missed takes allow you to take it again. Take two.
Love it. All right, Dr. Dan Siegel, tell everybody where they can find more about you and get your books and all that good stuff.
Sure, Kevin. I think the easiest thing is just go to my website, which is drdansiegel.com, DRDANSIEGEL.com. And there you'll find a whole host of, video presentations you can learn from, books, also in-person things. There's all sorts of ways you can learn more about this approach.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's a pleasure, Kevin. Keep on doing the great work you're doing.
town to town, live life without a care. I'm as happy as a clown, with my 2 fists of iron, but I'm going nowhere. I'm the type of guy who never settles down. The pretty girls are, they know that I'm around. I kiss them and I love them, 'cause to me they're all the same. I hug them and I squeeze them, they don't even know my name. They call me the Wanderer, yeah, I'm the Wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. Yeah, I'm the Wanderer, yeah, I'm the Wanderer. I roam around and round and round and round. One more time, 'cause I'm the Wanderer.